Great. Good morning, everybody. It is my great pleasure to introduce today Matthijs Zoeter. Matthijs Zoeter is a PhD student at the Department of History of Ghent University. He obtained a master's degree in classics at Radboud University of Nijmegen in 2019 with a thesis on the letters of Sidonius Apollinaris. Afterward, he also completed a Master of Education, and in 2019, he joined the project of Lee Levanus entitled Lobbying in Late Antiquity. In the frame of this project, Matthijs carries on his PhD research on the letter collection of Basil of Caesarea, and his project is entitled Basil of Caesarea, Networking, Lobbying, and Self-Presentation in his letter and letter collection. The main focus of Matthijs' PhD is on Basil's use of letters for crafting epistolari personae, and also on how letter collection influenced the letter perception of Basil. And today, Matthijs will present a paper entitled The Entropy of Basil of Caesarea's Letter Collection. Matthijs, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Georgia. Thank you all for being here. Looking forward to the discussion as well. I'm now going to share my PowerPoint. Let's see how this works. If everything is correct, you should now see my PowerPoint. Okay, very good. Okay, yeah, thank you very much for being here. Indeed, as Georgia already said, this morning I'm going to talk about the letter collection of Basil of Caesarea, which is also the topic of my PhD. And more specifically, I will be talking about the formation of the letter collection of Basil of Caesarea, how it came about, how it emerged through history. And this has been a topic of a bone of contention among scholars working on Basil's letter collection for over a century now. And I think that the last word has not been said yet. To start with a cliché, what I'm going to present is really work in progress. And I know that is often said out of modesty, but in my case, it really is work in progress. And as evidence for that is that my presentation will not end with a conclusion, but more with an open-ended question, with a puzzle that I've not been able to solve. And I would really love to hear your ideas about it. So during the discussion following my presentation. Okay, the structure of my presentation is very simple. I begin with a very short introduction on Basil and his letters. I don't think that Basil needs a lot of introduction, but just to be sure that everyone is with me, I will say a few words about him. Then I will present to you two theories that have been put forward about how Basil's letter collection formed. And the first theory is by Marius Bessières, which he proposed in the 1920s. And the second theory by Paul Jonathan Fetwick about 70 years later in the 1990s. And Fetwick's theory is currently the communist opinion, the accepted theory. But I think that there are some problems with his hypothesis, and that is what I will try to argue in the third part, the problem of Fetwick's hypothesis. Then in the following parts, I will present to you some ideas of my own, which are still developing. And I will end with, as I already indicated, with a kind of problem about the whole topic of Basil's letter collection and its formation. Okay, well, let's start. Basil of Caesarea, the famous bishop of Caesarea, in Cappadocia. Basil was the bishop of Caesarea in Cappadocia. Why is it not working? That's over here. So Caesarea is the metropolitan city of Cappadocia. And Basil became bishop around 370 of this important see in Cappadocia. The 4th century was, of course, a very important area in the development of Christian theology, and mainly about the idea, the dogma of the Trinity, which is the Christian concept that God consists of 3 persons: God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. And in this century, it was much disputes whether all of 3 persons were God, and if so, were they all equally God, etc. And Basil was a very strong defendant of a particular group, the Homoousians, who believe that God the Father and God the Son and God the Holy Spirit were all equally God. So in this whole Trinitarian debate, Basil wrote through two very important theological treatises. The first is the Against Eunomius, the second one on the Holy Spirit. And Basil's view, Basil's theological ideas were declared orthodox at the Ecumenical Council of Constantinople in 381. And of course, they usually contributed to Basil's transformation from a quite controversial bishop during his lifetime into a father of the church and a champion of orthodoxy in the decades following his death. And this status of Basil as a church father, of course, also led to the preservation and copying and studying of his works. And beside his Trinitarian work, his theological work, also letters written by Basil have been preserved, which is the topic of today. In fact, there are 369 letters that have been preserved and that have been ascribed to Basil. Of those 369 letters, 316 are held to be genuine. And interestingly, of those 316 letters, there are 314 letters are outgoing. That means that Basil wrote this letter to someone else. And only 2 letters are letters that were written by someone else to Basil. Also important to note for the rest of the presentation is that almost all of those letters have been preserved in collections, so that are groups of letters in the manuscripts. So there are hardly any letters that have been transmitted out of collections. The oldest manuscripts are from the 10th century, and it is also important to note that there is no manuscript that preserves all of the 369 letters of Basil. Some manuscripts are very extensive, more than 300 letters, but none of the letters has all of the letters. So you need more manuscripts to come to the grand total of 369 letters. When did Basil write these letters? 14 letters have been dated to before he became bishop, around 370. Well, 235 have been dated during Basil's episcopate, and the remainder of the letters have not been cannot be dated with any certainty. Well, of course, Basil wrote about a variety of topics, but in a significant number of those letters, Basil wrote specifically about church politics and his problems. There are a lot of controversies in Basil's letters, so controversies with his theological opponents, with his friends, with his fellow bishops, with his assistant bishops, and a lot of problems in Basil's letters, which is, I think, a very interesting characteristics of Basil's letters. And lastly, and very importantly, most likely, Basil did not publish a collection of letters by himself, unlike many of his contemporaries, such as Gregory of Nazianzus, Libanius of Antioch, Ambrose of Milan, and Symmachus. And this last point, of course, raises the question, if Basil did not publish a letter collection by himself, who did? How was Basil's collection formed? Well, over the past 100 years, there have been 2 important theories that have been put forward about how Basil's letter collection was formed. And I will now discuss the 2 most influential. The first one is by Matthijs Zoeter in the 1920s. Matthijs Zoeter was the first one who seriously studied the transmission of Basil's letters. And Zoeter, for the first time, drew a stemma of the manuscripts that contain a collection of Basil's letters. His main criterion was the order of the letters in the manuscript. So when he read the manuscripts, he noticed that the order in which the letters appear in the manuscripts is not the same across all the manuscripts, but vary. So based on this, he argued that 2 manuscripts that share the same or a very similar order belong together, are either interdependent or go back to an archetype. And by doing that, he was able to distinguish 2 families within the manuscripts with collections of Basil. And he further subdivided those families in so-called corpora. And corpora are groups of manuscripts that share the same letter order. You'll see that there are 2 names under the collections. First 2 letters, and then also between the brackets, I will use the name for the corpora which stands between the brackets, which is the name that Fetwick gave to the corpora. So, but Bezier did something more, because to determine the relative date of a collection, Bezier assumed that the less logic underlies a letter order, the earlier it is. So his argumentation is very simple. He said that chaos always precedes structure. So if you have a letter order which is very chaotic, with not underlying logic behind it, that is always more ancient in time than a letter collection that is very structured, because he argued a copyist or an editor would always try to bring structure in a letter collection and not the other way around. Well, because one of those corpora, that is EC, which you can see over here on the left side, because EC has the most chaotic letter order, he did not see any logic behind this order. EC must contain, according to his argumentation, the most ancient collection. And all of the other collections, all of the other corpora and both families derive from EC, from this particular corpus, from this particular letter order. So what is Bezier's scenario of how Basil's letter collection was formed? Well, first of all, he imagined that someone, maybe Gregory of Nazianzus, Basil's friend, made a core letter collection of about 100 letters. And over the centuries, sub-collections, so small groups of letters, were added to this core of letters in a random way. So without any consideration for structure, for design, they were just added to the collection. And that's why EC has such an illogical, chaotic order. And then in the next step, the order corpora were created from EC by editors who tried to bring order in this chaotic manuscript, or in this chaotic collection. So Bezier imagined the Basil's collection grew by a process of random organic growth. It was a letter collection that grew over time by the addition of sub-collections in a random way. It's important to note that Bezier's idea was accepted for the next 70 years. Both that EC was the most original collection, the priority of EC, and the way in which Basil's collection, letter collection grew, thus in an organic, random way. Until in the 1990s, when Fetwick, Paul Jonathan Fetwick, published the first volume of his enormous and exhaustive work on the transmission of the letter on the transmission of all the works of Basil. And in 1993, he published the first volume on the transmission of Basil's letter collection. And Fetwick revised Bezier's ideas, both his stemma and his and Bezier's theory that EC is the most original collection. So this is the new stemma that Fetwick drew from the letter collections of Basil. It is still in two families, and Fetwick used more criteria, not only the order of the letters, but also text variances, also the inclusion and exclusion of certain letters, and also the headings above the letters, so the title above each letter. And this is his new stemmata, which partly overlaps with that of Bezier. Fetwick said not EC, but EA is the most original collection. So they are related. But interestingly, EC isn't very chaotic letter collection. EA is very much structured. So it is very rigidly ordered, structured by edicy. So first letters to the first edicy, then the letters to the other edicy. So it is a very structured letter collection. And Fetwick's argumentation for this is as following. First of all, he said that in EA, the titles are very short. So mostly it is like Basil 2 and then the name of the edicy. Well, in EC, the letters, the titles above the letters are longer. He says the titles in EA are short, whereas in EC, they are longer. Although neither is original, it is obvious that the compiler of corpus EC is not as innocent of editorial intervention as claimed by Bezier. It is to the author of EA that such credit should go, since he limited himself to the shortest identifications possible. And the editors of C, on the other hand, lack historical sense and overcompensate this by appending elaborate headings. The second argumentation is Basil's archive. According to Fetwick, in Basil's archive, letters were filed by edicy, and in the manuscripts of EA, you still see that the manuscripts are ordered by edicy as well. So, all things being equal, EA as a particular group presents the letters in their most natural environment, which is that of lots or batches, something that the very first editors of Basil's letters must have encountered when they were going through Basil's files. His last argument is that at the end, EA ends with a group of 40 anonymous letters. Well, those letters have been left out in EC. And according to Fetwick, it is more logical that those letters were left out intentionally by the editor of EC than that they were included intentionally by the editor of EA. So Fetwick's scenario is as follows. For and while the files of Basil's archive, the edicy-based files in Basil's archive, circulated independently. Then the editor of editors of EA grouped those files together, as he said, in a simple, almost mechanical way. This again, without any consideration for structure and design. Then the editors of EC split those letters and changed the order. And Fetwick does not know why they did that, but according to him, they followed some obscure plan, which is not immediately visible. Although Fetwick's and Bashir's theory, of course, differ on many points, the bottom line is that Fetwick as well believed in a process of random organic growth in which Basil's letter collection came about. So, although Fetwick's theory proposed about 30 years ago has now been accepted as the theory in which Basil's letter collection was formed, I think there are some problems with Fetwick's hypothesis, both on the level of argumentation and on the level of his assumptions. So to start with the former, I don't see how titles can be an argument for the relative date of a manuscript, because as Fetwick himself admits, the titles were added later in, they're not original, but they were added later. So in theory, the titles could be added at any time in the manuscript transmission between Basil's death and or oldest manuscripts in the 10th century. And they say nothing about the relative date of a manuscript. And secondly, the way that Fetwick phrases it, short titles, it seems as though he thinks that that short titles are a defining characteristic of EA, while long titles are a characteristic of EC. But if you look at the titles, as I've done here, there are 23 cases in which EC has indeed longer titles, and about 8 in which EC has very, very longer titles than EA. But there are also 5 instances, 5 letters in which EA has the longer titles. So there's an example of it. But I think most importantly is that in 234 cases, or 90% of the letters, there is no significant difference in titles. So I don't think that is a good argument to use for the priority of EA. Well, secondly, Patrick's second argument that Basil's archive was felt by edicy is not necessarily true. He does not back it up with any evidence. In fact, if you look at what we know about letter archive from antiquity and late antiquity, it is clear that multiple filing systems were in use, and it is not necessarily so that Basil's archive was felt by edicy. And thirdly, the group of 40 anonymous letters, I think the same counter argument can used here as by the titles, that those can be added at any time in the transmission. So it neither says something about the relative date of EA as a collection. Then the underlying assumptions. The first one, both Bashir and Fetwick hypotheses are based on the idea that Basil's letter collection was formed randomly. I'm not a fan of the notion of randomness because in recent research on antique letter collections, I think it has been made clear that collections were very often carefully produced works with not randomness in it. Collectors and editors made conscious choices which letters to include and which letters to exclude in a collection. This is a point that was very well stated by Sonio, Watts, and Storin in their introduction to their volume on late antique letter collections. They said that ultimately we can speak of an author in relation to late antique letter collections, even if the author's identity is hard to pin down and his role in shaping the work is quite complicated. Authorship implies a basic intentionality. A text comes to be because an author crafted it with specific cause in mind. So there's always a kind of intentionality of choice involved, because someone always chooses which letters to include and which letters not to include in a collection. And it is definitely true for EA, because unlike what Fetwick argued, that it is a randomly composed collection, I think the order is clear of EA's letter order is clearly designed. So this is a point that was already observed by Radekalwitz in 2017, and I've elaborated on it. So as you can see on the screen, it's the macro structure of EA, and EA has a very clear structure. Begins with letters to close friends and families, then to religious persons and communities, and it ends with letters to friends and people less close to Basil. So there is a very clear hierarchy in the structure of EA. So regardless of the question whether EA or C is the most ancient collection, both Becher and Fetwick and most scholars working on Basil's letters assumed that the first collection of Basil's letters was, in any case for the greatest part, formed organically, so by a process of randomly adding more and more independently circulating sub-collections together. And this has been the general view on how Basil's letter collection was formed. However, it is not the only possible way in which Basil's letter collection might have formed in antiquity, because in antiquity and late antiquity, many letter collections go in fact back to a primitive collection, like that of Ambrose and Gregory of Nazianzus and Libanius and Isidore Pelusium. And well, it was my question, is that also possible for Basil? Might it also be an option for Basil's collection? So what I've done is, this is still work that is developing, but I've compared the transmission of Basil's letter collection to letter collections about which we know for sure that they were formed out of sub-collections in an organic way, like that of Jerome and Augustine and others. And you see some very striking differences. So first of all, in those manuscripts of organically grown collection, you see that the collections in the manuscripts also grow over time. So earlier manuscripts contain smaller collections of letters than later manuscripts. This is of course logical because those sub-collections were added to the collections, and that is why they grew over time. This is what this is what Divjak, specialist on the letters of Augustine, writes about it. Briefkorpora lassen sich ab der Karologiner-Zeit feststellen und nehmen im Laufe der Zeit an Umfang zu. So enthält der Codex Paris BNNA 1672 84 Briefe, die aus den 15. Jahrhunderten stammende Sammelhandschrift des Vatikan, Vatlat 499 249 Briefe. Apologies for my German. So those letter collections grew over time. But if you look at the manuscripts of Basil's letters, you see that from the very oldest manuscripts in the 10th and 11th century, we already have fully fledged collections with over 300 letters. So there is no indication here of growth of manuscripts. So from an early stage onwards, we already have very big collections. Secondly, unique letters. So in the manuscripts of organically grown collections, you see that one branch of the manuscripts have a great number of unique letters because they were formed from other sub-collections, and only later they were put together. If you look at both families of Basil's letters, family A and B, there is a huge overlap, about 95%, between the two families, and there are hardly any letters that are unique to either family A or family B. So this is either the result of contamination, or the two families in fact go back to the same archetype. Thirdly, you see in letter collections that grew organically and were formed from sub-collections that there is also a strong transmission line outside of the collections. However, in the case of Basil, there are only a few letters that have been transmitted outside of the collections, and that are first and foremost are that his canonical letters, that are the letters that later would become canonical law, and that have also been transmitted in manuscripts containing canon law. However, they also have a second transmission because they also have a transmission within the collection. So they could also have been taken from the collections to the canonical law manuscripts. But outside those letters, there are almost all of the letters have been transmitted in collections. A fourth point is that in those organically grown collections, you see a mix of incoming and outgoing letters. So both letters sent by the author and letters received by the author. And according to Ralph Matthijsen, he wrote an article on the letter collections of the West in 2018. The absence or near absence of incoming letters in an author's oeuvre is an indication of a literary planned collection. But what we see in the case of Basil is that there are only one and arguably two letters, incoming letters, are included in the corpus. So someone must have chosen on purpose only outgoing letters in Basil's letter collection. So of course, all of this, of course, all of those facts about the transmission of Basil's letter collections are not conclusive, and I think you can find counter arguments to each of them. But I think together they make the case that Basil's letter collection, in fact, goes back to a primitive collection, at least, in my opinion, a viable possibility. However, there is only one thing. So now we have looked at the transmission lines of Basil's letter collection, but what do we see if we look at the collections itself? And it's a last argument that needs to be considered. And it is here that my research has gotten stuck. Namely, what does the letter collection itself tell us? So this is a quote from Cribomont in 1983, who believed that Basil's letter collections, he worked in the tradition of Béziers, and he believed that Basil's letter collection was formed out of circulating sub-collections. And he writes, so for every single letter, it is useful to know not only that they belong to family EA, is family EC, but also their number in the collection. In the same way, it is interesting to know that letters that precede or follow it in the collections of manuscripts, because in this way, one has the possibility to grasp the traces of primitive series that have formed the great collections. But whether in Greek, in Latin, in Syriac, or in any other Eastern version, it will undoubtedly be possible to discover traces of small collections of antique origin. However, this kind of work has not yet been done. So according to Cribomont, if you study the collections of Basil's letter collections, you will be able to find traces of those sub-collections. And this work has still not been done, but I have made a start. And that is the document that I also circulated to you beforehand, and I will now switch to it. You can also find it on the PDF in the chat. So, and this is what puzzles me a bit. So you have two columns. In the left column, you have a manuscript from the A family, from EA, so that was Fedwig's favorite. And in the right column, you have a manuscript from the B family. There are a few things that you see the letter on the left side is the number that the letter has in the manuscript. Under Maurice is the number that is given by the first editors to the letters of Basil. So that is, you shouldn't pay attention to that number. It's just kind of the name of the letter. And then you have the name of the editor of the letter. Whenever two sections both appear in EA, in family A and B, I've given it a color and a number. So a few things immediately strike, I think. First of all, you see that there are a lot of many same sections. I've counted them until AJ, so that is about 30 sections that appear both in family A and family B. And that is, I think, a strong indication of either subcollections or that they go back on the same archetype, on a primitive collection. However, what also is interesting is that those sections do not appear in the same order. They both start with A, but then you see that family A and B has the sections in different order, which might be a stronger argument for subcollections, because then they would, I mean, if both family A and B go back on subcollections, then you wouldn't expect the same order of the sections in both families. However, you see also broad patterns in it. So in the first half of both collections, you see that the letter order, the sections really vary in order, but the further down you go in a manuscript, there is more overlap, which might be understandable because it is especially in the first half of the collection that you put the more important authors and that you want to change things to give the collections a different outlook. However, what puzzles me most is that the sections, although both sections appear in both families, the internal order of the sections also vary. So, for instance, the section B was written to Basil's good friend, the Bishop of Samosata, Eusebius, starts with letter 34, 27, 30. But you see that in the B family, the order of those letters is completely changed. And I don't know what to make of it, because if those letters, if those two families go back to subcollections, you would expect that these subcollections, which were incorporated in the bigger collections, would retain the same order, internal order of the sections. And that is indeed what you see with, for instance, Augustine. So the subcollections do have the same letter order as when they are integrated in the bigger collections in the later manuscripts. But it's not what you see in Basil's letter collection. And I don't know how to explain it, and I hope you can give me some ideas about it. What might be useful to note here is that Basil's this text of Basil's letter collection has a clear counterpart in the transmission of a letter collection that is very closely related to that of Basil, namely that by Gregory of Nazianze. There we have six families, and you see also the same sections coming back, but also in a different order and also in a different eternal order. And most interestingly, the letter collection of Gregory of Nazianze, that is what we know for sure, go back to a collection that Gregory of Nazianze composed himself. So maybe it might be possible that this is just creativity of the editors, and maybe editors were not just random copyists who integrated sub-collections in a collection, where maybe they really thought about how to form letter collections and how to represent it. But yeah, this is something I'm not sure how to explain, and I hope you, during discussion, you can give me some ideas or new perspective, or any observation is very much welcome, and I would be very grateful. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. I'm sure everyone will join me in thanking you for a very nice paper. Let me just adjust one thing. We are opening now the floor for conversation. You can either wave at me in the screen or raise the hand electronically. I'm happy either way. I'm going to throw in the first question, if you don't mind. I'm curious about the titles. You've mentioned them briefly, and you showed us a couple of examples. How developed can they be? The examples you showed us had the addressee and a bit about the content, so they were descriptive a bit. How do they have a textual history of their own? How does that go? Because that goes in parallel with the collections in some ways.
Yeah, that's the point. Fetwick, in fact, argued that those titles have a transmission of their own. Yeah. Because there is not an overlap, not always an overlap between a letter order and titles. So within the same families, you can have different titles, and some of the titles, same titles, also appear in family B and in family A. So it seems that those titles have a separate transmission on their own. So it is even possible that an editor with a manuscript of the family A used a family B for the titles. That is possible.
So adding to the mess a bit.
Exactly.
Of course, it's not going to make it
to
easier.
The entropy. Yeah.
Okay, we have two further questions. Professor Shirinian, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for very interesting conversation. And of course, I would like to warn you that in Armenian tradition, we have letters, not only whole corpus, but many letters by Basil were translated. And I just want to warn you to maybe you should do a comparison of the medieval transmitted letters, their order in Latin, Armenian, I don't know which languages, to see how they divide it. Because in Armenian, for example, let me just bring one example, the letter under the number 216 to Optimus is considered as the 20th letter, homily, not letter, he said. I mean, they did not number it just occasionally. They have something in mind. Of course, they had principles to number them. And this question actually, I mean, very complicated. You also mentioned Gregory of Nazianzus. It's really did not investigate it very well, because with Gregory of Nazianzus, we have more complicated patterns that they are combined in collections. So maybe something like this was there also. So it really should be examined in a context. And that's bizarre, because to bring all these versions together, I know it's a very complicated thing, but this is the only solution that you can succeed to have idea why they were numbered like this. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. And I'm very well aware of it, that also outside Greek, there are many languages in which letters of Basil have also been transmitted, not only Armenian, but also Syriac and Georgian. Fortunately, Fetwick has done great work on that, so he has given a good overview of those transmissions. It is interestingly that there are not that many letters that have been preserved outside of Greek. Also in Armenian tradition, there are a few. So, and all of those letters also appear in Greek, so there are not separate transmissions as well. I think the strongest transmission outside of Greek is that in Latin, Rufinus translated some of Basil's letters, 2 or 3. Mostly ascetic letters have been translated in different languages. Also, the canonical letters of Basil. And of course letters on theology. So there are always very specific letters that have been translated by the other languages. But I'm not sure if I understood your point. You said that the letter to Optimus, which is 260 in Greek, what number that has a different number in Armenian? That's interesting.
It's referred under the number 20.
20.
Yeah.
And by whom is that reference to? I mean, how does it work, in manuscripts or by authors?
Yeah, in manuscripts and in other works, because, for example, when they are citing, for example, they citing the letter to Optimus by Basil, they are saying not letter, but the homily. It's called homily. Yeah.
And they call it homily number 20.
Yeah. And
okay.
by the way, I don't know what they have in mind when they translate it. It's when you say it's not so many, at least more than 20 homilies are translated into Armenian. And
letters, I'm speaking about letters.
Letters and homilies. You see in Armenian, sometimes it's called letters, sometimes homilies. There is no clear division of these.
Yeah, that is also true. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and I just want to say that they choose the letters which are canonically needed, but not the ones, for example, Basil has few letters about Armenians in Asia Minor. Those letters were not translated.
Ah, okay, that's interesting. Yeah.
This is very interesting.
Yeah.
They did not translate it what they were interested in, but they translated the one that were important.
Were needed. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you both. We have in the other order, it's Catherine, Valentina, and then Marta for questions. Yeah, Catherine, please.
Hi, thanks for an interesting presentation, really complicated.
Yes.
And I will have to agree that not copying letters, if people bother to copy letters, they must have a reason, because from my experience, people usually just chuck them out. So I'm not surprised that the Armenian tradition is, very limited. 2 basic questions. You did mention Gregory of Nazianzus, and some of Basil's letters ended up in his collection.
Yes.
And obviously he had an interest in presenting himself as a friend. Could you maybe make some comments about what you think Nazianzus's relationships might be to the formation? And the second question is, I don't know how A and B relate, whether A is a bit older than B, or, if you have a sense of when they emerged. But I know from Chrysostom's letter collections, which has got really messy manuscripts, is that sometimes it's the history of the manuscript itself can give you a bit of a clue, like if the manuscript was put together for a particular person or by a particular, especially this goes more a bit later in the transmission when you get to the Renaissance, when, editors are working, but certainly you saw it sometimes in the early ones, and that goes back to about the 10th century as well, their transmission history. Have you looked at any of those factors as possibly throwing some light onto the transmission history?
Yeah, the origin of the manuscripts, you mean?
Who put them together? Like, are the letters in a manuscript that's just letters, or is it a collection? Is it a composite manuscript? And I found the composite manuscripts, which are really messy, tend to be very interesting in throwing out. But I'm not a manuscript expert, so these are really naive questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. Your first question is a very good one about Gregory of Nazianzus' relationship to Basil's letter collection. And that's especially interesting because we know from a letter 53 that Basil wrote to his grandnephew Nicobulus that Gregory of Nazianzus made a collection of Basil's letters. He said that. He said, here you have a collection of my letters, and they begin first with the letters to Basil, from Basil, and then my letters, because I want to put Basil before me in every respect. And that was the reason why Bashir thought that a first collection must have been made by Gregory of Nazianzus. So that is why he thought that the first 100 letters of EC were the collection that was made by Gregory of Nazianzus. But I think since Rudbeck in the 1950s, I think, and also Fedwick, and everyone now thinks that this letter collection that Gregory of Nazianzus refers to is the correspondence that has been preserved between Basil and Gregory. So that this is the letter collection that Gregory refers to in this letter, and that Gregory's letter collection began with the correspondence between Basil and Gregory himself. And what you then see is that because in many manuscripts, the collections of Basil and Gregory were transmitted together, that some of the letters that belong to Gregory's manuscript also came to Basil's letter collection. But I think in 2001, MacLean made a very good argument that, in fact, the correspondence, about 15 letters correspondence between Basil and Gregory, that is still being preserved, has its origin in the collection of Gregory and not in that of Basil. So I think they were transmitted from Gregory's letter collection to Basil's letter collection. And that is why you see in all of the collections of Basil that the letters to Gregory is at the beginning of the collection. It makes sense if they were added later, then you would either do at the beginning or at the end of a collection. But that is, I think, an interesting point about Gregory of Nazianzus' relationship. And your second point about the origin of the manuscripts, I have looked at the origins of the manuscripts, the 10th, 11th century, but it's very, very diverse. And it is, if there's not a colophon or something in it, it is very hard to trace back what the origin of a manuscript is. Some are in Greek, some are in Paris. So I'm not sure if that is possible to do. And your second point about the manuscripts in which Basil's letter collection has been transmitted, either in composites, manuscripts, codices, or alone. That is something I'm going to do for my next chapter. And I think that's a very interesting way to go forward. So with what other works did they combine Basil's letter collection? And what does it say us about how did they perceive Basil's letters? But that's definitely something I'm going to do, because I think that's a very interesting way forward. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Valentina, and then Marta. Valentina?
Yes, thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. I have 3 questions which connect also to previous one and to one Matteo as in the chat. So the Armenian that was mentioned, or the Syriac versions, do they help in some way to reconstruct the history of the text, or have a marginal value, if you have ever examined this? And then the second question is, how many manuscripts do we have in Greek? Like how wide is this the tradition? And the third, which also was a bit touched by Catherine, is can we, do the themes, like, I don't know, ascetic themes, more church politics themes, tell us something of this concerning the transmission, or this is completely out of interest? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, first of all, okay, I'm not a serialist. I'm not an Armenianist. How do you say that? So what I know is based on what others have done with Basil's letters. They are not of that great value because they are quite often very literal translations, at least in Latin, that I know that are very literal translation. I don't know about the Armenian, to be honest. And I think Syriac is also our very literal translation, and there are not that many letters, both in Syriac or Armenian, that have been translated. What is interesting is that in Syriac, there are 5 letters written by Basil that have not been transmitted in Greek. And that is, I think, the only letters that we know that don't have a counterpart in Greek. And that is something, those letters, I think 2 of them have been edited and studied. And both both scholars think that these letters are authentic in a way. So that is very interesting. The second question is, I can't answer that question about how many manuscripts. So there are 19 letters that have transmitted on letter collection. So at least 20 letters or more. And if you look at manuscripts that have a few of Basil's letters, 1 or 2, for instance, the canonical letters, then you speak about a few hundreds. So it's quite extensive in a way. And the last question is very interesting about the themes. Yeah, that is something I've been thinking about. There are certain very important themes in Basil's letter collection. First of all, that is what I already said at the beginning. There is a very strong emphasis on controversies, church political issues, and that kind of thing, and Basil's role in it, by Basil's defense. There's a lot of letters in which Basil has to defend himself against accusations from others about heretical thoughts and that kind of thing. So you see, that might be done to. So in the few decades about Basil's death, the group of the homoousians to which Basil belonged was still a minority. So it might be that it was also kind of way to defend Basil against accusations that were still in the few decades after Basil's death going on. A second very interesting emphasis, or rather de-emphasis, is his family. There are no letters to his families apart from 3, 1 letter to Gregory of Nyssa and 2 letters to his uncle. And most interestingly is that those are very negative letters. So in those particular letters, Basil had a conflict with his uncle, and Gregory of Nyssa tried to intervene between his uncle and his brother by sending fake letters in name of his uncle. And Basil discovered the forgery, and then he sent this letter, letter 58, and he's very angry with Gregory of Nyssa. Why did you do that? And you're not a good Christian, and that kind of things. So I found that very interesting. Why would you include 1 letter of Basil to Gregory? I mean, he must have written many more. And this is a very negative letter. So I'm not sure what to make of it, but I think something is going on here. In terms of aesthetic letters, there are quite a few letters to talk about specific aesthetic topics, but maybe not as much as you would expect from Basil, who is also considered to be the founder of one of the founding fathers of monasticism in Asia Minor. So most of the letters are focused on present Basil as bishop, as an important metropolitan bishop of Caesarea. I think that's the big theme of the collection.
Yes, thanks a lot. So there is seems to be an intention in the way in the selection.
I think so. I think so. Yeah, I haven't talked about this during this presentation because it was about transmission, text and transmission. But I think there might be some intention in it, certain emphases in the collection.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you both. Marta?
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank you for the job you are doing, because I think it's extremely important. And if you when you finish, it'll be something that will change. I'm sure will change our way of seeing Basil and his letters, and we are still waiting for the critical edition that maybe you will do, I hope, or someone after you. I have just a remark. While working on Eustathius of Sebastia, that was my field of research, I discovered that Gregory of Nazianzus and Basil weren't friends at all. It's not my my invention. It was MacLean first, I think, and there is a big research on that. I can provide you with references if you want, and that's one point. And then Gregory of Nazianzus constructed an image of friendship after he returned from Constantinople to rebuild his position in Cappadocia. That's a hypothesis of MacLean that I think it's really, I mean, it's convincing. Yeah. And yeah, so that's why maybe Gregory of Nazianzus constructed a collection of Basil's letters in a view to make, you know, to exclude some letters, to add some others. And connecting to that remark is that Basil wasn't Homoousian at all. He was Homoousian, and there is also a literature on that, and it's very convincing. And it was Gregory of Nazianzus who promoted Trinitarian theology, Homoousian, and he was the first to say that the Holy Spirit is God as well as Father and the Son. So it's also important that he wanted to make an image of Basil, Orthodox Basil. I mean, Orthodox in that time, because before Constantinople, it was an Orthodox to be Homoousian, let's say. And last thing, what you said about family doesn't surprise me at all, because in my research, I found that Basil was influenced by Eustathius, and he was his pupil, let's say. And the part of Eustathian asceticism was to promote separation from families. They were in opposition to what Gregory of Nazianzus and Gregory of Nyssa believed in. They promote very close family relationships. So, but anyway, maybe it will help you, maybe not. But what I wanted to say, first of all, that thank you for your job.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I found it a very good idea that, first of all, I'm very glad that someone who knows more about theology of Basil than me give some feedback on my paper. Thank you so much. Yeah, you're absolutely right about that is something MacLean has been arguing in some articles, and most recently Bradley Storing in 2018 published a book about the same topic, in which he argued that Gregory really constructed the image of friendship between Basil and Gregory, and this is of course an image that in the end won the day, because now everyone thinks that Basil and Gregory are kind of inseparate friends, which might not have been the case. Really be the case. So that is very interestingly, and maybe that is also a clue why, if all the letters to Gregory that now are at the start of Basil's collections, in fact go back to Gregory's letter collection, that means that in Basil's original letter collection, if that existed, there would not have been any letter to Gregory of Nazianzus. Yeah, that's also a thing to think about. Thank you so much. Yes, that is also a very good point, that Basil was not as orthodox as he would later be considered in the decades after his death. Especially his views on the Holy Spirit. He was not very clear about that. And you see also in the funeral oration that Basil wrote, that Gregory wrote on Basil's death, that he tries to kind of hide Basil's, of kind of apology, make apologies for Basil's not sufficient theology. And maybe that is something that can be connected to the emphasis in the collection of Basil's letters on Basil's defense against accusations of heresy, just to create an Orthodox picture of Basil as well. So I think that's a very, very interesting point. And your last point was about Eustachius, the influence of Eustachius on Basil, and especially the separation of family. But still, I think it still surprises me that the only letter that you includes in the collection that is written by Basil to his brother, who is also one of the Cappadocian fathers, is a letter in which Gregory is presented in a very negative way. It might be have to do with something. Basil was maybe not very fond of his brother, and that might have been the influence of Eustachius. But still, there's also later perception. A later editor, decided to include one letter to Eustachius, to Gregory of Nyssa, which presents his brother in a very negative way. And I'm still not sure what to do with that. But thank you. The Eustachius thing might be something I have to look in. Further. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We have another question, a couple of questions in the chat, or question and comment. So Anahit says, thanks a lot for your very interesting presentation. Just a little question. Can we connect somehow Basil's letter collections to the liturgical cycle? Like, were the letters read on certain days during the year? Have you met that situation?
I've never heard about it, actually. It's homilies for sure. And some of the letters were considered in the transmission as homilies. No, I don't know, actually, but I've never heard about it. But it might be interesting. I don't know.
No, it is interesting. No, thank you. Catherine has a minor point on the correct terminology, for which Gregory argued is God the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit was considered tritheistic. Catherine?
It's just something very minor, because I taught a unit on Gregory this last year, and I had to be very careful because I wasn't a theologian either. So
I see your point. Yes, it's true. It's true.
One last question from Georgia then.
Yes, thank you very much, Matthijs. I have plenty of questions, but I'll limit myself to one for the sake of time. Thank you very much, first of all. And I was wondering, you mentioned that there are some variants between the families, and I was wondering whether they are the usual variants that we see in error transmission, or we can see traces of reworking or abbreviations, or like, are there just minor points, or do we see big differences between the two? Thank you.
I have not studied the text that much, but what I've seen so far are just minor differences. The biggest differences are in the titles, actually. Sometimes a different name appears, for instance. But in terms of text, there are not that many differences. Actually, the text is very homogeneous. The text has been very well transmitted, in the sense that there are not that many variants between the texts. So that's a good thing.
So the variants don't help you in reconstructing the origin. That's a pity.
No, I don't think so.
Okay, thank you.
Let's accommodate also a question from Andy.
Hey.
Thanks very much. This has been a wonderful talk. Also, the Q&A has been really interesting. My question is more or less sort of a conclusory one as well, which relates to some things we've talked about already and some questions that have been asked, and that is I shouldn't say purpose of this collection, but maybe purposes of these collections, which is, of course, the purpose for which you prepare a collection would also explain how it is formed. And for example, I know from the Syriac tradition that these texts are used, some of these collections are used for education, So is this also the case in the Greek tradition? Can you tell from the way collection is formed? And can you also tell, for example, from marginal notes, that kind of thing? And I've forgotten my other question, but I mean, can you tell in certain cases where of these collections what their purpose was? Is education one as well? I mean, you've talked about, for example, some letters are transmitted independently because they're relevant for canonical reasons. I saw one of the Syriac translations also is a letter to some monastic community, and it's used in a monastic context. How does it work in Greek?
So what you said about the sections, are that also letters? You said that from the Syriac, you know that some sections were used for educational purposes.
Yes, the letters were definitely used. I think
Basil's letters as well.
Yes, yeah,
okay.
yeah.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, for that you should check the work of Jonathan Loofstra. He's published a book recently on the Syriac Masorah, and a lot of it was on Basil.
Okay.
But I'll send you the reference.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah. I don't know from any references, but if you see some subsections are letters specifically on asceticism. So I can imagine that were used by monastic communities to learn from Basil the Great, the great monk, the great ascetic, to younger ascetics, how to, there are also quite a few letters included, I think about 4 or 5 included in the collection, that are written by Basil to young ascetics, people who want to become ascetics. And I can imagine that the purpose why those letters were included is also to have them read to other people, young people who also want to become ascetics, and see what the great Basil himself says about the topic. So that definitely, if you see at the texts that were translated or in Florilegia, the letters that were included in Florilegia and were translated in other languages are also very often ascetic letters and theological letters about how God the Father and the Son relate to each other, and the substance and that kind of things. So very Trinitarian theology. So that letters were, I think, clearly used as study material, or that were the letters that people found interesting and translated for theological reasons. But I don't know of any specific references. There is a reference to the correspondence between Basil and Libanius in the Zacharias Rhetor in his life of Severus of Antioch. And it is interesting that Basil of Severus wrote this correspondence between Basil and Libanius, and he found Basil the better Rhetor. And that is why he decided to convert to Christianity. So that might also be in use of the letter collection, maybe.
Yeah. I asked because, for instance, to give a very specific example, because when you sent the handout, I saw there's a letter to a physician called Meletius, and I checked, and it's just a few sentences, and basically it's Basil saying he's ill. So what would be the interest to put that in a letter collection? So do you see what I mean? Yeah. So for me, that might just be the interest, and that's what Catherine just mentioned, that Greek letters we certainly use this writing model. So this is sort of the thing I was, the thing I was. So this is okay. So this is the case. Yeah, that kind of thing.
That's in fact, that's a very good reference, because Photius in his Bibliotheca gives advice to others what to read. And about Basil's letters, he said you can read Basil's letters, which is a good model for writing. So in the business, they were definitely used as models for writing as well. And of course, some of the letters must have been included because of the nice writing style and that kind of things. But I'm not sure if that's the only purpose. Because indeed, there are some very boring or very short letters, like Basil complaining about his illness, quite a lot of letters. We see do this. But they're not the letters that were translated in other languages or incorporated for Florilegia. So most readers of Basil's letter collection might have been interested in different topics than those letters.
Just a thought that I just had. Would, in that case of Meletius the physician, for example, would that also be included because of the identity of the addressee himself, because otherwise it's of very little importance. So maybe it's important here to show the network that Basil had instead of anything else. So this is
definitely,
okay.
yeah. And as I said in the EA, the letters are ordered hierarchically. So it begins with the very important Ambrose of Milan and Libanius and so. So that's definitely meant to broadcast Basil's network and his importance as a bishop. Yeah. Thanks so much. Yeah.
Okay. No, thank you. Thank you.
That seems to be the case too for Gregory. He was really keen to advertise his network, and he also apparently wrote part of his collection as letter models for his nephew, which was the original request. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. That is what he said in one of his letters indeed. Yeah. Thank you so much.
And on that note, I would like to thank our speaker today for an excellent paper, and to everyone who joined in the conversation and the paper. Wish you a very good day. This makes for a very good start of the year for our seminar, and see you everyone next time.
Okay, thanks so much.
Yeah, goodbye everybody. Thanks for joining.
Bye everyone.
Bye bye.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.